Hi, I'm Diane,
And I'm John.
and you're listening to
Paranoid Fantasy.
Hi, John. What are we talking about today?
Well, today we are talking about Gettysburg. We're talking about the famous Airbnb, the first Airbnb, I might add. Why would we call it that?
Well, because it has to do with bullets and biscuits.
Bullets and Biscuits in Gettysburg. Yes, Mary Virginia Wade, born in May 21st of 1843, also known as Ginnie Wade. She was a resident of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and she lived in Gettysburg during the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the important, significant battles of the Civil War. It was not, the first or the last battle, but it definitely was a great loss for the Union, um, the North. So we actually did take a little trip through Gettysburg about a week ago and stumbled upon this beauty of a tourist attraction.
Yeah, it was there. It was in the town. We saw the house where she was actually born, which was in the town proper, and then a little ways up the street was the house where
the
it all
the
happened.
famous incident happened. Now, I might add, um, at the time of the incident of Jennie Wade, she was 20 years old, and she is known to be, or she's advertised as the only direct civilian casualty of the Battle of Gettysburg. Later, we'll get into the details of the story, but let's just go ahead and describe our day in Gettysburg. We pulled in, it was about 95 degrees.
Yeah, and there were people running around, much like they were running around during the battle, wearing uh, layers upon layers of gingham and wool.
Yes, it was pretty hot in there, and there are some reenactment characters, especially in the toured sections. I went to Gettysburg as a child. That was one of the places that my father thought would be really fun for us to go. So I do remember seeing the famous Jennie Wade House. I never went inside, but I think it was definitely part of a lot of the ghost tours, which the whole area of Gettysburg has really capitalized on because it's not an active battlefield, although they are preserving it. So I think they do get a lot of mileage out of the this, keeping it alive through ghosts and ghost walks and
Yeah, the battlefield themselves were really, you really got that feeling of history, and there's some beautiful memorials out there sprinkled across that battlefield. But in town, it's a little more today, and people are running around and having a good time and buying antiques and rubbing elbows with these.
memorabilia,
Yeah,
rubbing elbows with the famous landmarks
reenactors.
and
Yeah.
reenactors. And several times a year, they actually have enthusiasts come from all over the world and they set up in the battlefields and they reenact certain parts of it. But it's just a total wealth of knowledge. It's a very famous battle that happened there, and it really changed the direction of American history. So the paranoid fantasy under all of this is I always think it's really interesting when a town has a sort of claim to fame. Like you were telling us, near your hometown of Fort Wayne, there is a neighboring town that has a famous attraction. Just quickly tell us what that is.
A giant turtle who they named Oscar. A farmer had this pond on his property, and he claimed that there was a Nessie-sized turtle that was in this pond, and it caused quite a stir. And to this day, they have turtle days with a parade and
Right.
festivities.
And I was just in Rome, and for example, and not to be sacrilegious, but they have the stairs that supposedly Jesus walked up during his last judgment. And of course, it's become like a mecca for people to, visit and wait in line and I assume pay money and then buy souvenirs. So there's other places like that I'm sure we could think of. I mean, off the top of your head, can you think of any?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think anywhere where something historical happened, the people today are trying to, keep people interested in coming there to their towns to invest their money, and keep the town alive. Yeah, we have the Farnsworth Museum, the house where the first television set was invented, and so that's kind of interesting. And
Yeah,
so
it provides something to do. But the funny thing about the Jennie Wade House is they do get very specific in the tour of what she was doing. However, there is like wallpaper from the 1990s on the wall. There's a 1950s tablecloth in the kitchen where the incident happened, and it was very amusing to me as you were taking studious notes on the story of how inaccurate a lot of the details in the actual house were. And part of its charm is that they seem less interested in preserving the site, if it is in fact a true story, than adding some theatrical charm, like the mannequin under the
that's what I was thinking.
quilt.
In the basement, and they added some things to the tour that I think that they probably, maybe Jennie. There's a sign on the outside by the flowers that says Jennie doesn't want you to walk on the flowers, but I guess she doesn't mind that everyone know that her father was a tailor and he served 2 years in solitary confinement for ripping somebody off for $350, and then he ended up in the almshouse because the cheese kind of slipped off his cracker. So that was part of the information that we got that day, and I felt kind of bad about knowing that. I really didn't need to know that.
But let's go ahead and take a break, and then we'll talk about the actual tour itself.
All right.
In your own words.
That sounds good.
Okay, so we're back. So you start the tour. It's in like a
gift shop.
It's a trailer behind the actual house.
Residence. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then it's full of books on Ginnie Wade, and one of the books is actually called Bread and Biscuits.
Yeah, Bread and Biscuits, and that's where we got our. We saw that and we realized that this probably was the first Airbnb.
Yes, exactly, but not quite so. So you go in the house. Well, you get led out of the trailer into the home by a woman in colonial. I want to say civilian wear, no, Civil War, mid-19th century apron and petticoat, and she begins a tour, and she explains what happens to Jennie. Let's start from the beginning, if you'll walk us through it.
Okay, well, Jennie had a sister named Georgia. Georgia had moved up the street, which was at that time sort of out of town. The rural community took over really close to the downtown area.
We're talking like a 2-minute walk.
Yeah, it's not that far, but they said, her sister lived out of town, and she had just had a newborn baby. She was pregnant, and an hour after she had the baby, the Confederates came through the town, and that was on June 30th. There were scouts. So then July 1st, they met and they fought for 3 days. And so Jennie's brother Harry was 8 years old and Isaiah was 6 years old. So she took them up to George's house that was a little bit out of town.
Right, and there's conflicting reports because some reports say that she went over there to visit her sister and be with the baby and cook dinner for her. But the other report that's actually on her birth home on Breckenridge Street says on the early day of July 1st, she actually escaped the nearby battle that she could hear beginning in the northern part of town. Mm-hmm. So anyway, just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, and she apparently saw some of the troops. First, the northern troops came through, and then then the southern troops came through. And when her side went through, she was carrying water out to them in buckets to the roadside.
She walked down. Her mother was there. The sister was there, in the sister's home, Georgia's house, right?
Yeah, and the two little kids, Harry and Isaiah, and the newborn baby.
Well, she wasn't pregnant.
No, Georgia had her baby just like a day before.
And they had moved the bed downstairs. So
yes. Describe
the room.
Well, the room we walked into, first we went up the stairs and we noticed that there were big holes in the facade of the bricks. And then the actual door had probably a 50-cent piece size hole
Right.
clean through it. You could see inside.
And my first reaction is that's not the original door. It's painted, and why would they leave this out just for like over 170 years just exposed, and it's still in this condition? But there's my paranoid fantasy. But you go in the house, I
That
mean,
it's a
it's
hoax.
not like one of our, what do they call them, the Big Mac houses of our time. It's not. It's just literally
We walked into the kitchen.
the kitchen, which is probably like an 8 by 10 room.
And they had the original dough pan, dough keeper that they would knead the dough, and then they would put it in that and close it. It was a wooden, about the size of a cradle actually, and they would leave it in overnight and let it proof or rise, and then they could use out of that. And so that she showed that where there was a door that opened to the sitting room or to the front room, and apparently Jenny had there was a cannonball had gone through the roof. And so Jenny thought, well, I'll pull this door that between the rooms open behind me so that door sort of protects me as well as the front door.
So on that morning, again, we say that they could hear and see, I mean, because they have glass windows all throughout the house, that the Confederate Southern soldiers were racing through the streets, the Union soldiers were racing down the street, and behind them the Confederates were chasing them. So the Confederates had gone north of Gettysburg and were chasing the Union soldiers down. The Union soldiers were trying to get on higher ground because they thought that they could fight back better, but the Confederates were on top of all the buildings in Gettysburg, shooting the cannons off the top of the buildings, and there's just rounds of
Ammunition.
guns,
Bullets.
muskets, bullets going off and hitting inside of well, as we obviously see, maybe many of the houses, but only fatally inside of George's house. And so, according to the tour and the books available, Jenny begins to read her Bible, and she goes on to say a few verses, and George is in the bed in the downstairs living room, which has been converted into the bedroom, and she's like, come on, please stop. And then apparently Jenny sort of whips into action and begins, again, this is the part that I don't really understand, kind of taking bread and water to these Union soldiers that are sort of surrounded by the house because they've been attracted to the open windows and the smell of cooking, breezing out into the fields around. So the soldiers are kind of like hanging out, and she's serving them as if it's a canteen. And that's the part that I couldn't really get into, because I'm thinking, I mean, even in like 2019, I only have enough bread for like maybe one or two people, or enough ingredients.
Well, in that dough tray, like I said, I mean, it wasn't like, and it had to proof and it had to rise, then you had to beat this dough down, then it had to rise some more. And that tray was probably big enough to say, like a double loaf of bread today. And so it was almost like, the Sermon on the Mount with the loaves and the fishes. I mean, apparently that little dough tray served hundreds of biscuits. Yeah.
Well, so in the midst of it all, a bullet does end up going through the living room and ricochets off of the bed post and actually makes it onto the mantle. And there's actually a bed in that room with a bullet hole where they describe that the bullet actually came within, just inches of George's head, but missed her, and then fell and rested on the mantle, and one fell and rested on the bed. So, I mean, it was pretty. It's just that the story they were telling didn't totally match up with what I feel people would do in a normal situation.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. And then Jenny said, or was reported to have saying, if anyone dies here today, I hope it's me, because Georgia just had her baby. And that might be maybe a little bit of a clue, because I think she just had that baby the day before. She probably didn't feel too mobile. And
right.
she, to just...
And my mother really kind of like put it into context. She's like, John, today, like, to hear gunfire outside or a battle or even sirens, like, it's really alarming because we're living in the 21st century. But back then, maybe the people were just made of something a little bit stronger, and it was their obligation to get involved. And
well, they didn't have armor piercing bullets back then, so that was a brick house, and they probably felt fairly safe within the confines of that brick house. It was just the two wooden doors. She had the one closed behind her and the one that was to the outside that didn't stop a particular bullet, and it actually struck her as she was facing the
Well, let's slow down here.
okay. I want to tell what.
Well, yeah, we've got to build it up, Diane.
All
okay,
right, that's
so
true.
she's baking bread.
She's baking away.
It's around 8:30 in the morning, and our tour guide, I didn't get her name, but let's not mention it, because I
Okay.
think she sort of reaches over this little dough table at the horror of the 7-year-old behind her in the tour, and she says, "This is the position Ginny was in when she was shot." And I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
No, it's not funny, but it's
No,
like...
we're just looking at her and it's like, wow.
Yeah. So the bullet entered the exterior front door, went through the interior door between the kitchen and the living room, and apparently, and this is on every account I've read from that foundation, the Ginnie Wade Foundation, that she was struck by her left shoulder, it pierced her heart, and she immediately died. Every single, no matter how much the details vary, it always says she instantly died. And I think that's because there's children on the tour. But she, is immediately enshrined as a martyr of the Civil War, and she's the only civilian to die in the Battle of Gettysburg.
And she wasn't like out trying to be a soldier. She was in the kitchen baking bread. I think that's kind of an interesting little side note.
Right. I kind of interrupted you.
You did? Did I interrupt you?
No.
Oh.
Okay, but let's keep going.
Okay.
So, and because you're going to keep going, I want to say, I feel like when I saw this story 10 years ago, that's where the story ended. But my paranoid fantasy is because there's a gift shop on the other side that they extended the story since then, and now the tour continues up and through the house, down the back door, and back into the gift shop trailer.
Yeah, they actually take you through a hole in the wall upstairs where supposedly a shell had gone through the roof.
A cannon.
Yeah, a cannonball, and it had broken through the brick wall that divided the two upstairs rooms, so that most of the fighting was on one side of the house, and they couldn't run out the back door to get to the cellar, which had an outdoor entryway, like many of them did, like on the Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy runs and she's trying to open that cellar door and she can't get in. They had a cellar door like that, so they couldn't go out into the rain of bullets. They had to go up the stairs through the hole in the wall that the shell had made. Supposedly a couple of soldiers had come up and kicked those bricks away so that it was large enough that they could kind of shimmy through there. They passed the kids through there. They passed the baby through there. The mother said she wasn't going to go unless she didn't want to leave her daughter's body, so they actually took her up there, and she was actually taken through that little opening in the wall as well. And then they were able to go down the stairs and out the door into the cellar. So where we were confronted with a very large oil painting. And
All right.
yeah, that's on the wall down there. And if they told us if you count the people in the painting, you'll see that there's one person that's not there, and that's the mother, and it's because it's entitled Through the Eyes of a Mother, and so we don't see her personage in the painting, but rather it's inferred through the title of the painting, which was actually pretty cool. But also down there is a kind of a a spook house.
Right behind the tour guide where she's speaking, there's actually there's basically like a bed where supposedly they took Jenny's body, and there's a mannequin on the bed, and you just see these little feet sticking out of this quilt. So I mean, it kind of crosses the line of a historic tour and a haunted house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you actually felt like what it was like to be down there, between the painting and her. And also what we kind of got a kick out of upstairs was that there was a bed up there, and she had to show us that where you take the piece off the headboard that is actually a roller, and you soften your mattress with it, and so that's where the term "hit the hay" started from. And then also the bed, instead of springs, it's suspended by a series of like a rope weaving, and there were keys that you could turn that, and it would stretch those ropes to make it a
Tight.
firmer bed, and that's where sleep tight, and then don't let the bugs bite, because
You
that
pound
was
the
a problem.
bugs with the rolling pin.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great walk through American history. I don't know if there's any more, details other than the price. I think it was $9 just for a general adult ticket.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they talked about the relationships between the three friends. It was Jennie and the boy that she was engaged to be married to, who was fighting for their side, and then their other close friend had gone and gotten work down in, I think it might have been Charlotte, and he really liked Charlotte. He liked working there, and he liked living there, so he went ahead and joined up with the Confederate side. But the friends saw each other during the battle, so it's kind of really just shows how that battle really did tear apart the very fabric of our country at that time.
Well, I'm still more interested in the bizarreness of the presentation.
Which is what led us there to begin with.
Exactly.
And then they said, please go upstairs and exit through the gift shop.
Right.
Which we were looking at each other and just grinning really big, because it struck us both pretty.
Right, and actually there was a woman there with her children, and she actually was like sobbing through the entire thing, so I felt kind of jaded. I don't know.
Yeah,
I tried to
guess
get into it, but it was just too bizarre.
Well, and they kept telling us this was the only portrait of Jennie, and then like in the gift shop there were several other portraits of her.
In the last room before we hit the cellar, there was another picture of her, and might I add, they were both Xerox copies from like a Kinko's. It was just weird. I don't mean to be disrespectful, because I definitely thought it was worth the money because of the campness, but I'm not totally convinced she was the only anything. Or that even happened. I don't know. It's just so.
Well, I had a paranoid fantasy next to that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, please.
Next to that bed upstairs, that I was going to end up with bed bugs or
Oh,
something.
okay.
So I was having my
On
own
that
little
note,
personal.
Let's go ahead and end this episode. You've been listening to
Paranoid Fantasy.
And just to let you know, we might put some pictures of our trip up on our Facebook. You can find us on Facebook at Paranoid Fantasy Podcast.